This picture of Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann playing on a beach went viral on the internet. Here in the picture, it all looks pretty friendly. This is a few weeks before the tournament where the scandal happened, and then suddenly everything changed. So what happened between Miami and the Sinquefield Cup? Today we'll look at the highlights of this story over the past few weeks. I'm going to give you some new details that will enlighten us a little bit in this direction. D4, D5. We'll take a look at the first game. We have two games, and you'll see how good Magnus Carlsen is at theory. Knight to c3, knight to c6. This is a bit of a stupid move. Bishop f4, and here e5, sacrificing a pawn right away. Hans Niemann wanted to set up something in the style of the London system, but here he had a surprise. He should have taken the e5 pawn with bishop. On knight e5, de. On d4, move the knight back to b1. White would save their pawn here because the d4 pawn hangs after knight f3. Of course, there was some compensation, but after de, a mess begins. g5. That's the depth of Magnus's preparation. He knows some tricks in all situations. On bishop g3, d4. Attacks the knight. What do we do here? Knight e4, we have to retreat. h5, h4 threatens, h4, bishop f5. The knight hangs. If we take g5, then an unpleasant check follows, and this is where the devastation begins. Black can take c3, then cb threatens. This is extremely unpleasant, so knight d2. Hans Niemann retreated to cover this diagonal. g4 followed, and that's where Anish Giri's analysis ended. He didn't know what happened in the game later, but he said that Magnus easily led the game to victory because he had an overwhelming advantage there. And this was already on the 8th move. Magnus easily defeated the strong grandmaster with a rating of 2,700. That's the level of the world champion. Now let's get to the second game. They played two games. Both of them, Hans played white. Knight f6, e4, d5. Magnus plays in such a provocative manner, fooling around a bit in the opening. You can see that it's quite informal beach-style game, so to speak. On e5, knight d7. As if giving up a pawn, but after knight takes, knight b8 follows. And then he wins back the d4 pawn, so there was little point in taking that. Hans plays knight f3, knight b6, h3 to keep the knight from moving to g4, h6 to keep this position for our bishop. So if we play f5 right away, then white can move their knight to h4 and black has to move away from this diagonal. So h6, a3 is a strange move. Deep prophylactic against the idea of bishop f5 and knight b4, so c2 doesn't hang. Bishop f5 follows, and g4, an aggressive move. It might have been better to develop like bishop e2, bishop e3, and then castle. But he plays g4, bishop h7, and sacrifices the pawn by the move e6. What's this move doing? Han wants to stall his opponent's development as well as weaken his king. After fe, bishop d3 follows. Captured. Captured. Check is threatening, but Magnus is not afraid of it. On the contrary, he opens his king even more by playing e5. He wants to play e6 to get the bishop out. Check is an unsuccessful move. It was better to capture the e5 pawn, even with the knight to then make the way for the f pawn. After check, king on d7 has a good position. He can castle by hand. de, e6. The king has a great position here. b3. You can see that Hans is afraid of Magnus. He sees threats everywhere. He played b3 to keep the knight from moving to c4. It's not the strongest move. He should have moved the knight to e2 to bring the knight to the attack, or at least on the move queen e8, play knight f4 to reinforce his queen. After b3, Magnus plays queen e8, and here Hans understands that the endgame for him will be worse, plays queen d3. And after queen f7, we can see that black has a dominant position here. Then the world champion moves the bishop to c5, queen to f8, and just crushes Hans Niemann. So in both games, the world champion dominated, so he got the impression of Hans Niemann's levels of play. He saw his weakness and definitely figured he was no match for him. You have to agree that Magnus easily beat him. Now let's move on to the part where the grandmasters comment on this scandal. Subscribe to our Telegram channel to keep updated with all the news and interviews about this situation and more. Stay tuned for more news in the chess world. Let's start with Magnus himself. He finally made a statement, and he thinks Hans Niemann was cheating in the game that they played in the Sinquefield Cup. A couple of days before that, a curious reporter asked him again what he had to say about Hans cheating about his game. He said he wouldn't say anything yet, but he praised the good work of his trainer Max Delugi. Magnus expressed his respect to Hans Niemann's coach, Maxime Delugi. That was already quite a hint because Max DeLugi has been banned on chess.com since the first titled Tuesdays he was identified as a cheater. Accordingly, if your coach is a cheater, why not cheat yourself by learning some skills from your coach? And now let's move on to the interview with Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. Let's start with Nepo. He recorded an hour-long podcast. I listened to it and highlighted for you the most interesting moments. Believe me, he said a number of facts that clarified the picture. When I received a letter from the organizers notifying me that Hans Niemann would play in the Sinquefield Cup, I was alarmed. I asked them to take extra measures to make the tournament safer and cleaner. Of course, they didn't do anything until Magnus withdrew from the tournament. I completely understand Magnus and his decision. I think it certainly had a bad effect on the overall atmosphere of the tournament, but I can still understand him. Nepo also commented on the rapid rise in Hans Niemann's rating. Before the pandemic, I had no idea who he was. I played against him quite often on chess.com, including titled Tuesdays. And he often showed some strange solutions. In fact, he's the only young player I had doubts about. Naturally, one can stagnate for a few months. It shows that a chess player needs to keep working hard to gain the necessary experience or extra confidence to get to the next level. But in this respect, Hans Niemann is a unique example because his stability is unique. He showed good results time after time and progressed in the rating, something I hadn't seen before. I also didn't like his confession that he cheated in order to gain some rating to play against stronger opponents. That sounds like a pretty common excuse, like, I'm doing some bad things, but, for the greater good. I'm concerned about his situation. If you allow yourself to lie to the whole world to speed up your progress and do it for the greater good of becoming a good chess player, that's a wake-up call. I don't believe in magical transformations. Immediately after participating in the tournament in Turkey, he returned to the US to play in the Sinquefield Cup. They were two different chess players. In Turkey, he was an intermediate-level player, and in the USA, he became a super grandmaster right away. I don't believe that. That's strange to me. Well, from this interview, we can conclude that Nepo suspected Niemann of cheating for a long time and was even wary when he was included in the tournament. And Fabiano Caruana added to this information very well. Here's a summary of what he said. As soon as Magnus heard that Hans was invited to the Sinquefield Cup as a replacement for Richard Rapport, who could not make it to the USA because of some logistical issues, he was already considering leaving. He didn't want to play in the same tournament with Hans Niemann because he'd been suspected for a long time by then. What's relevant is that Hans had shown a willingness to cheat. If he's willing to do it once, you can speculate that maybe he's willing to do it again. That shows a facet of his personality, and it means that for him, it's not an evil or a prohibition. As for Professor Kenneth Reagan, who didn't detect any evidence of cheating in Hans' play, I would take his analysis with a large grain of salt because I know of a very high-profile case where with absolute certainty, I can say that someone was cheating, and the person was investigated and was also exonerated based on Reagan's analysis. And I'm certain that there was cheating. For me, it's just an open and shut case, so someone really has to very blatantly cheat to get detected by his method. In general, the problem exists. It must be recognized, and in the last year, I've been asked several times about Hans Niemann's cheating, which means that this situation is not new. He's been a suspect for a long time. To be honest, I don't think Hans has cheated over the board in the last 2 years, but the fact that he allowed himself to do so, it does make him something to keep an eye on. Magnus has never accused anyone before. He's always very reserved and consistent in his decisions. Fabiano's podcast colleague at the end asked a question from subscribers. Does Fabi think that strategically placed beads are a viable cheating method? To which Fabi replied, I'm not an expert, maybe ask your proctologist. It was again a reference to the tweet by Elon Musk. What conclusion can we draw from this story? Hans Niemann has been suspected of cheating for a long time. Both Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen before the beginning of the tournament asked to increase the anti-cheating measures, and Magnus wanted to withdraw from the tournament whatsoever. This means that the reputation of Hans is ahead of his actions and he'll have to whitewash it for a very long time. And I thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Give this video a like and don't forget to hit the bell button as well to make sure you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Keep playing and studying chess, and I'll see you soon.